This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Gotta remember to smile. Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the 43rd Right and Left Discussion Forum. The purpose of our discussion forum is to demonstrate that civil discourse is not only possible when discussing potentially contentious topics, but that it is a necessary component of a peaceful and prosperous society. Our topic today is term limits. And the question is, are we likely to be better governed with or without them? Our panel today, beginning on my left, is Bryan Laubaugh, president of RMD Financial Services. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Tom Finley, founding partner of the Great Lakes Resource Center. And on his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and current member of the Wadsworth City Council. We turn first to Bryan. Bryan, there are a lot of people who believe that public officials remain in office too long, that they become less responsive to the needs of the governed, and that the best way to control that is mandated term limits. Do you agree?
I agree with the first part of that statement, that when individuals stay in government for for their lifetime, they do become less responsive. I'm not sure if term limits actually will work. In the state of Ohio, we have term limits. Our governor and our state senators and our state House of Representatives, they're all termed out after 8 years. But what happens is that they can jump from the House to the Senate, and do 8 years and go back again. And so it sort of defeats the purpose. The idea of a lifetime limit has been bandied about, and that never seems to get much traction. So I'm sure there's a solution to this, and I'm all for the citizen legislator, that the individual serves in the government, he goes back into his community, has to live under the laws that they passed and experience what it's like on the other side, not working for government. And I think that's a good experience. If they want to come back after a mandatory time out, if you will, 4 or 8 years, let them throw their hat in the ring again. Also, I think we do have, in essence, term limits in that we have elections. And the elections, I think the founding fathers looked at that as a way to limit people from making, government service a lifetime endeavor. So I do see a need for something there. And really you have to sort of mitigate that with the idea that institutional knowledge is built up over a long period of time. And knowing the ropes, so to speak, being able to navigate through government and through the legislative process is always a benefit. But there has to be something that clears, clears the path for new blood to come in. And I think that's what creates some of the problem is, the incumbent definitely has an advantage. And it's very hard once you get someone that's in there for a long period of time to get them out. So I think I'd be interested in hearing what everyone else has to say. But something could be done. I'm not sure if it'll work.
Well, it sounds like we can put you down as solidly on the fence.
Yeah. Even though this was a big issue for the Republicans. Term limits was sort of a rallying cry, and I never really got on board with that because of the issues that it brings up. So you could say I'm pretty much on the fence on this one.
Let's have your take, Ron.
The more I looked at this over the last couple of weeks, the more solidly I come down in favor of term limits. One caveat on the election thing, it doesn't seem to work. We have something called gerrymandering. It's very hard to get somebody out if he doesn't want to go, he or she. And I think in 2014, I saw a statistic that something like only 4 incumbents lost. 4.
Let me give you this. I looked this up. 91 in the last. I can't speak for Tuesday.
Well, this is midterm 2014.
Yeah, the 91% of the United States Senate was reelected, and 90% of the House.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the idea of the citizen legislature, that's really an 18th century concept. That was the founders wanted to do that. They felt people should come in. Roger Sherman wrote about this, Robert Sherman of Connecticut, from which the town of Sherman, Connecticut was named. I lived near there. Says that the people ought to go back and rub elbows with the people and not spend all their time in Washington, but to come home and be immersed in the everyday life so they knew what the constituents were doing. And I agree with that. Yeah, there's the concern that you lose dedicated people, but fresh blood is a good idea. I mean, I'm old enough that I have a real trouble thinking outside the box, of thinking of fresh ideas. And I know there's guys particularly in the Senate, who are older than I am. Not that that's bad, but but it's real. It's real. No. And so control the House by the people, not by the participants. Mm-hmm. And by opening this up, you get more participation because more people are going to want to come in and run for Congress, particularly the House now. Mm-hmm. Let's limit that to 3 terms. Let's make it 6 years. Mm-hmm. There's a movement afoot for that. Because there's an experience cited with California a couple of years ago. They put in such a situation, and after the first election, almost 50% of the new legislators were freshmen. And they were from all walks of life. A very small percentage were from legislative age that moved up into office. And it's either a good or a bad thing, depending on who you get.
Well, we're going to circle back around to that
idea,
because I want to try something on you. Tom, where are you coming down on all this?
Well, first thing I ask is, what would be the purpose of term limits? And it would seem like it's an attempt to bring accountability to a politician, if you will. Unlike what I'm hearing here, the Constitution really never provided for or meant to have career politicians. Well, whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure about that part. But I think term limits is trying to look at symptom and not cause, because it seems to me we're searching for accountability. And right now, there are no provisions for accountability for our politicians. Some place that focus on what did you accomplish, what barriers did you run into, and what are you going to do in the future? Just looking at reports or keeping track and being accountable for those 3 areas is not occurring. So we're searching for some solution. I am for term limits, only as a short term. It is not going to solve the problem of accountability.
Patty, now we turn to you.
Well, as my fellow panelists have said, there are good arguments on both sides of this. If you don't, one of the reasons not to have them is because you're removing your leaders, the people with experience, and there's a learning curve. Although I would think after 4 or 5 years, hopefully you would be on track with that. I look at my own experience on council, and we have one member on council who's been there for quite a number of years, and it's really helpful to have him there when we're discussing issues that started 10, 15 years ago, which some of us may not be aware of, but he was there when that legislation was passed, so it does help to have that experience. But of course, on the other hand, you're making it difficult for, as you said, the incumbency re-election rate is extremely high. It does make it difficult for a new person to come in, so you don't have that fresh blood. Also, you have a seniority system set up then where the new guy coming in may be the sharpest, brightest person in Congress, but they're not going to get a political assignment that is one of the plum
a committee
choice,
assignment.
A committee assignment, right, because of their lack of inexperience. One of the most interesting things I found, and if you are going to have term limits, they need to be set that you can't beat them like they do in Ohio. I mean, we've had politicians from this county or that represent us that have been in politics for 30, 40 years.
You can name names if you'd like.
Well, Ron Amstutz did that. He bumped back and forth between the And not that he wasn't a good legislator. It was just that he was bumping back between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Batchelder was there for years. Now, that was really a benefit to Medina County. Then he sat out as a judge, but then was able to come right back. So there's no limitation on it. One of the most interesting things I found, and something which I really think I could get behind, are term limits on the Supreme Court. And you might think, well, you know, it says in the Constitution that they are appointed for life. Well, number one, when the Constitution was established, they didn't think people were going to be living till they're 110 and still sitting on the Supreme Court. As well as that, there's a phrase, and I make sure I read this correctly. It says they are appointed for life during good behavior. Now, you talk about a phrase that is up for discussion and what it actually means, but what has been suggested is that a term of 18 years, 15 to 18 years, be established. And I really kind of like this idea, and that in odd years, and they would be staggered so that at every odd numbered year, you would appoint a new Supreme Court justice. That would mean then that each president, whether Republican or Democrat, during a 4-year term would be able to appoint 2 members of the Supreme Court, which I think would lend to a more balanced Supreme Court and a changing of the guard. And 18 years is not a short amount of time. But right now we have justices that are sitting there forever. They are waiting, and in some cases staying long beyond the time they should be, because they're waiting for the time when their party's president is there. So that's when they can retire, and for that reason then the appointment becomes politically motivated. And I do have some concerns with that, and that's something I would like to see investigated. Because normally when we think of term limits, we think of our local elected officials. We don't think of that Supreme Court because
I don't.
It's always for life, but I thought that was interesting.
I usually think about the United States Congress, and there is no doubt, and I think that we're probably all in agreement, there's a lot of mischief that can develop if somebody is in office for too long. And I think that my mind goes to Senator James Eastland from Mississippi, who was in the Senate for over 30 years. He was an avowed racist, but not only that, I think he was head of the Agricultural Committee, and he was also a big landowner in Mississippi, and gave himself $55,000 a year per crop, and I'm not sure how many crops he had. But back in the 40s and 50s, $55,000 was worth a lot more than it is now. But the scary thing about him, with his seniority, he became president pro tem of the Senate for a period of time. He was second in line to the presidency. And I think that when you look at his background, there was nothing really virtuous about him. But then you ask yourself the questions. The people in Mississippi knew all about him. Didn't they have the right to vote for him? So,
but it's that incumbency factor, though, as well.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Thomas, I think it was Jefferson wrote that when you have individuals that stay too long in government, they become despotic, in that this particular gentleman had, in essence, created his own little monarchy. And that's one of the things you really want to steer clear of. You know, with a two-party system, I think if both parties got together, when the Republicans brought up term limits, the other side of the aisle, they didn't, you know, that was not something that they wanted to champion. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the old, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. For instance, recently, they've changed some of the rules in the Senate. Those rules are going to come back to bite some people.
Yes, they are.
Now that the majority has changed in the Senate, we'll see how happy they are with some of those changes. So I think if we rule from the middle and say, you know, do we really want to change these rules because someday the power will shift and we're going to have to live by them. The same is true with redistricting. For the longest time, you know, the Republicans sat on the sidelines while redistricting took place, and then all of a sudden the Republicans have the power and they redistrict it, and now all of a sudden people are squealing about that. So we really need to look at that and to make sure that if we're going to change a law and we're going to change how things work, we're going to be able to live with it when the other folks are in power. So.
Redistricting is complicated, but there was a man in my Sunday school class that said, give me a map and a ruler, and I'll do it.
Right.
Right.
So.
John, I would like to just step back from a little higher altitude and look at this for just a moment, because there, cause and effect, I'm always trying to look at. And so if you brought up Mississippi, if you look at why that could occur, the number of people voting continues to shrink. And so that produces symptoms. And one of them is
30% in Ohio this year, something like that.
yes, and so you begin to say, how could that happen? And so we look for things like term limits to try to get around the ills that are occurring all around accountabilities, instead of what's causing the apathy. And it's certainly connected to this lack of accountability and communication that's meaningful to the constituencies in which they represent.
I'm going to ask you this question with the fear that by the time we get done answering it, we're going to run out of time. But the president said that on Tuesday, 2/3 of the voters stayed home. And I'm wondering about the third that actually voted. Are these the strong, committed, well-informed folks? Or are they the knee-jerk vote for my party kind of folks? I mean,
there are some statistics on that.
Is that right?
And I don't know what they are, but I remember reading them once when I was in the school business and the passage of levies. The people who are negative always turn out.
Right.
And so you're faced with that part of the population. And I don't think it's any exception when we look at our government and our officials that we're electing. I think that's an operable thing that is occurring.
Okay, we got away with that.
I personally voted for a number of Republicans, but that's me.
Well, yeah. I voted every opportunity I get. So
Paul Ryan, Sr., was on Meet the Press with Tim Russert at one point, and he was espousing term limits. And Russert says, "Well, Senator, you're not. You yourself have given that up. You're continuing." He says, "Yes," but I'm doing it voluntarily. There's voluntary term limits and there are mandatory term limits. If you have voluntary term limits, people aren't going to leave because the bad guys are going to stay in because they're getting something out of it. They're getting something personal out of it. If you have mandatory term limits, then that clears that out.
Yeah. Well, we know that we've got an opportunity, like Bryan said, the voters have the opportunity to get rid of anyone we choose. But it's always that sort of thing. I think that Congress has like a 26% approval rating.
Is it that high?
But it's always my guy's okay. It's all those other guys.
yeah.
But it's the voters that have the responsibility. But let me ask the question this way: are term limits just the American way of wanting everything to be fast and easy? Is this sort of like the fast food remedy to the problems of bad people staying in office too long?
Well, I think that's why I'm saying it's a short-term fix. It's not. It's really looking at symptom and solution. We're back to the accountability, and we say, well, they are accountable because every time we have an election. Well, it's a little late. Plus, that's not an accountability report. That's a campaign, and boy, the misinformation and all of that occurred during that is a far cry from accountability.
I think more so than that, I think it's an attempt by citizens to make everything fair. We have this, I always think life is not fair. Some things just aren't fair, but we have a tendency as Americans to think everything has to be fair. So we're going to spread it out, give everybody a chance, and in some cases you can't do that.
It really comes to, doesn't it, John? Americans seem to have an innate fear of an elite ruling class. We broke away from monarchies. Did you ever read Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well, here's a good old Yankee. He's back there in medieval England or wherever the heck he was, and fighting all of that and trying to make a democracy happen in the medieval time. It didn't work, but but he was yanked out from his time travel prematurely. But I think that's more than the fast food thing. That's we don't want an elite thing. I think if I read a report, a fellow was testifying to Congress, somebody from a place called the Cato Institute, and he says whenever he says, well, we should limit term limits for senators and so on and so on, he always gets a big applause from the audience. He thinks that's symptomatic of that, and I agree with that.
Well, let's circle back to the career legislator. A couple of folks have mentioned it. When I think about that, back in the 18th century, Isn't it sort of a quaint anachronism at this point, when you stop and think of how big and complicated government is, that how big and expensive each individual legislature's office and staff are? Is it really a good idea to have high turnover in those areas? And thinking about this, one of the big arguments for term limits is that we need fresh blood, that we need to have the new ideas coming in, and that will somehow end gridlock. And I'm thinking about new people that have come into the United States Congress. I'm thinking about Trey Gowdy, Ted Cruz, and Rand Paul. Are these people more likely to compromise on issues than? I mean, are the new people going to be a positive influence on gridlock or negative?
Win some, you lose some.
John, the answer.
You got to come up with something better than that.
Well, you look at the situation that we have, what we've created in our Congress, our federal government. It's an entitlement position at this point. In entitlement positions, people fight like the devil to maintain them. And so we are in a position as citizens to have created that through apathy or whatever, but it's there. So we look at gridlock, which again is just a picture, a symptom of this business of entitlement and protecting your territory and the whole business.
And the longer people are there, the more that
Absolutely.
It's a culture.
It's a structure that now it's going to be protected, and the biggest protectors of that are the parties. The parties recognize that.
Well, the landscape has changed. You know, when you read about the citizen legislator back in the day, they would leave their business and go to Washington for several months.
Yes.
They'd get the business of the country done, and then they would go home again.
Yes.
Well, now we have perpetual campaigning.
Absolutely.
You have a congressman that's got a 2-year term. The day he's elected, the very next day he's starting to
So you think in terms
run.
of longer terms?
I would be in favor of saying a congressman goes for, you know,
Yes.
I would agree
a
totally.
4-year term, so he doesn't have to worry about starting to raise money and be constantly campaigning, that he can actually focus on the business of the country
rather than
rather than all those other things that go along, and then you know, term the guy out after 3 terms, let's say 12 years in the Congress, and make a lifetime maximum. You know, say you can't make this your profession, and I think that's what's happened is that you know, we have bureaucracies, we have bureaucrats, but you know, we have elected officials that have made this their profession.
And the other thing, of fresh blood coming in, there's already a competent staff in place, or can be. He doesn't have to fire everybody, unless you change a party, perhaps. But it's there. That mechanism is there, and if he's smart, he can lean on that, and he can lean on his colleagues.
I think a lot goes back, and we mentioned this before, to the voter itself. And you know, one of the underlying problems that we have is that we have such a low turnout at the polls, and that in many cases the people that do show up at the polls are uninformed, or that they are strictly voting. Okay, I've got a D next to my name, so I've got to vote for all Ds, regardless of the quality and of that particular person running for office. I don't know how we fight that. I mean, I worked the polls Tuesday. You get a kind of a judge. It's very honestly, voters are skewed older. It seems like younger people, there are many that do, but not nearly as many as should. And those that come in too often really have no concept of what's even on the ballot. It's like my day to show up. I don't know how we correct that. I mean, John, you've made the suggestion before that maybe not everybody should vote.
Yes.
Yes. I wouldn't go quite that far, but I would love to see a much more well-informed public that is voting, and you know, that will actually put people into these positions that actually will do their job and not just make a career
Maybe
out of
you
it.
know, that sounds like a future topic for me. How do we do that?
John, may
How do we make voting more effective and efficient?
Okay, I want to circle back. There's a couple of remarks that have led me to this. So, what do you do instead of term limits? I think a starting point might be, for instance, the first campaign anybody wages is campaign to be eligible for election funds supplied by the citizens of this country, which would begin to weaken this
That's been
obligation you have to
Yeah.
others other than the citizens. So, if I were to look at a starting point, it would be there. I think there's merit in looking at term, I don't want to call them limits, rethinking terms, because I don't think 2 years in a Congress with this complex world we
I
have
agree
is time
totally.
enough.
Yeah. Well, the 22nd Amendment limited the president to 2 terms, and that hasn't really been a problem. I think there was some question that a couple of presidents wanted to repeal that amendment sometime in the middle of their second term, but I don't see that it has really been a huge problem. I think after 8 years,
They're ready to get out.
Yeah.
I think usually.
Look at the face of a man when he starts and when he ends.
Oh, absolutely.
Look
I
at
was
how the
thinking the
aging
same
process
thing.
you know what, he's going to
Yeah.
age anyway.
Not that much.
Yeah, look at John.
Yeah, well, 8 years
You know,
ago, I was
to Patty's point, I think the numbers would bear out Patty's observation is that when a person goes in, just look at the difference between the people that have the identifier, the R or the D, and then when you get to the judges. The numbers are all over the place. So that tells me that those people that went in they're not sure who or what, even though judgeships are supposed, they're
Nonpartisan,
nonpartisan,
technically.
but we all know that
Who the R is and who the D is.
who the R is and who the D is, and the person that goes into that booth that doesn't know who the R or the D is, all of a sudden they're just doing name recognition.
They are.
And if
Or
you
the name that sounds the most pleasant.
exactly, so when you look at those numbers, I look at the one judge, her last name was Kennedy. She got a ton of votes. I think people on the D side were voting because they thought Kennedy was a D,
She's a Republican,
and she was an R.
Yeah.
So I just.
There's another Kennedy story that we don't have time to tell, but I would love to share it sometime. In any event, thank you. This was really a good discussion. I do like the idea of expanding on it at a later date. I'd like to end with this quote. This is from a man by the name of William Eggers. Beltway politicians of both parties have proven themselves unwilling to relinquish control. One should not count on a ruling body to voluntarily divest itself of power. Thank you, William.